Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. This is the first session of this 10th CII ITC Sustainability Summit, and I'm very pleased to be with you all and I'm going to try and moderate what I hope will be a stimulating, open-ended discussion with a very, very eminent panel. So this session is entitled The Road to Paris 2015, and this title, of course, refers to the Paris Climate Negotiations, or COP21, which is scheduled to be held in Paris in December of this year. So I'll very shortly introduce the panel in greater depth so you can understand the credentials they bring to this discussion. But what we're really trying to do here is to understand what is at stake in Paris. What are the interests that India and Indian business has from the Paris outcome? But more generally, what is at stake for the global community? So before we actually get into the panel, I thought I'd take 2 or 3 minutes to try and set the stage for what is really at stake in Paris. So for those of you who follow the climate debate, these climate talks happen at a regular basis. COP21 means that we have had 20 of these kinds of talks before, so there's quite a few of them. But Paris is a landmark year because it marks the culmination of a multi-year process aimed at setting a framework to develop a legal instrument which will guide climate action, global collective climate action over the next 10 to 15 years. So this is a landmark event because it's meant to set the framework for the next decade or two. It's more or less become clear that the architecture of what comes out of Paris will be built around national contributions. And this word is important. They're contributions, and for those of you who are insiders to the climate debate, they're very explicitly not commitments. You get yelled at if you use the word commitments in the climate arena. So these are contributions. They're nationally determined, which means each country gets to decide what to contribute to the global effort. India is due to come out with its contribution this month, as are other countries such as South Africa and Brazil. Several other countries have already come out with their contributions. The advantage of this approach is that each country can frame their national effort in ways that make sense domestically. The potential disadvantage is that the total effort that countries, the total aggregate, if you add up what each country is going to do, it may not add up to what is required, according to science, to actually address the problem of dangerous climate change. So a lot depends on what Paris does to set in place a mechanism for the future and for future such contributions. So for India, the stakes are important in at least 2 ways. First, we worry, and we have always worried, that pressures to reduce greenhouse gases will limit our ability to use cheap energy resources for development. And this then leads us to be a little bit concerned about what the implications are for development, growth, access to energy coming out of negotiations such as Paris. But second, we are concerned, as we should be, perhaps not enough in fact, about how climate change itself will impact our development because of the negative impacts of climate change. So the question is, the challenge really for the Indian economy, for Indian industry, is to try and think through whether there's a trade-off between these 2 objectives. How do we make sure we have enough energy? How do we make sure we're not vulnerable to dangerous climate change? Should we, for example, worry growth now and climate later? Or is a green growth sort of story actually a reality and we can achieve both together? Now, in a sense, it's very hard for policymakers or even researchers to try and answer this question. The answer really lies with those of you in the room, because you make decisions about investments, about how to run your businesses, and you will basically interpret the signals that come out of something like Paris and help answer the question about whether the emergent framework being put in place and each country's national framework is a threat or an opportunity for your business. Or is it simply irrelevant? That's also an option that we can explore with the panel. And if it's irrelevant, then that's also bad news. Under what conditions will it be a threat, an opportunity, or irrelevant? And what can governments do to send strong price signals or other sorts of incentives for equitable, sustainable, and green growth? So these are the sort of questions that this distinguished panel will help us think through. And before we start the panel, I just want to briefly introduce them. I should note that each of you in your bags has more detailed bios, so I will have to be more short than their accomplishments really deserve, but I do want to say a little bit about their backgrounds. So to begin with, we have closest to me here, Shri Ashok Lavasa, who's Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. He has previously served as Secretary Civil Aviation and has held senior positions in the Ministries of Power, home affairs, and finance. So he has a breadth of experience across government. He has also been Principal Secretary Power in the government of Haryana. And among his other accomplishments, he has written several papers on economic, social, and security policy, and a book that after reading this I'm enthusiastic to get hold of called The Uncivil Servant. So I'm very curious about that in particular, sir. Next to Mr. Lavassa is Ambassador Francois Richier, who's the Ambassador of France to India and has been in India since 2011, so knows this country very well. During his 24 years as a diplomat, Ambassador Richier has served in Ethiopia, Berlin, the United Nations, and several high-level posts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France, including as advisor for strategic and security affairs at the presidency of the French Republic. So welcome, Ambassador. Next to the Ambassador is Mr. Juan Costa Clement, who is the Global Leader for Climate Change and Sustainability Services at Ernst & Young, leading a team of 700 professionals at Ernst & Young. He has also served as a member of the Spanish Parliament and has held senior positions in the Spanish government, including Minister for Science, Technology and Industry. Like Mr. Lavassa, Mr. Clement is also a prolific author, and the book that I have picked out that he has written is entitled An Unstoppable Revolution, so another one to look out for. Next to Mr. Clement is Mr. Doug Morris, who's the Deputy Minister Counselor, Economic, Environment, Science and Technology Affairs at the US Embassy here in Delhi. And his watch includes clean energy sources, energy efficiency, bilateral science cooperation, and so on. Mr. Morris is a veteran diplomat with 23 years of experience and has experience in East Asia, the Pacific, and in Washington, D.C. And not least, Mr. Jacob Worksman, at the end of the row there, is Principal Advisor to the Directorate General for Climate Action at the European Commission, where he works on the international dimensions of European climate policy. Mr. Worksman is a lawyer and has provided legal and policy advice to the UN, to developed and developing country governments, NGOs and international institutions, primarily focused on the climate negotiations. He has also taught and published widely on climate policy. So with these introductions, I'm going to turn to the actual meat of the event. We're going to structure this panel in three parts. We'll start with brief opening remarks by Ambassador Richier first, and then Mr. Lavassa, representing the French and Indian governments respectively. We will then turn to a moderated discussion with the rest of the panel, and Ambassador Richier and Mr. Lavassa are very much encouraged to join that moderated discussion. And then I hope to leave at least half an hour for question and answer from the audience. So with that, let me first invite to the podium Ambassador Richier.